Russia is actively recruiting fighters from other countries to fight against Ukraine. Among them is India, where nearly 100 residents were lured to the front under the pretext of war or education, writes The Washington Post. It is noted that this month, 32-year-old Indian electrician Binil Babu became at least the 10th Indian to die in the war against Ukraine, prompting a sharp reaction from local officials. This issue was vigorously discussed with the Russian authorities in Moscow as well as with the Russian embassy in New Delhi today. We also reiterated our demand for the speedy release of the remaining Indian nationals. The newspaper quoted an Indian Foreign Ministry spokesman as saying, "In turn, the Russian Federation has consistently denied any wrongdoing on its part and promised to release Indians from its armed forces. The Russian government has never been involved in any public or covert campaigns, let alone fraudulent schemes to recruit Indian citizens for military service in Russia," the Russian embassy in New Delhi said in a statement on August the 10th. Despite close coordination between the two governments, Russia is in no hurry to release mercenaries from India. Fraudulent recruitment into the Russian army has become a recurring point of tension between Moscow and New Delhi in the past year, the publication emphasized. Families of Indians killed in the war said many were duped by an international network of recruiters and social media influencers who promised them high wages for low-skilled work such as driving, cooking, plumbing and electrical repair. Instead, the Russians sent them to fight, the newspaper noted. 2 Indians recruited by Russia contacted by phone in 2024 told reporters that they were forced to sign Russian documents and their passports were confiscated upon arrival in the war zone. They said they were sent to fight without adequate military training. After several Indian citizens died in the war against Ukraine last year, Indian officials raised the issue with their Russian counterparts and secured the release of dozens of men who had been sent to military service, the newspaper recalled. However, some Indian citizens remain caught up in the conflict. An Indian government official recently confirmed that 19 Indian citizens are still serving in the Russian military. Despite this, New Delhi continues to develop trade with Moscow, the publication added. India is the second largest importer of Russian crude oil after China, with purchases worth $46 billion in the last financial year, according to statistics released by India's Commerce Ministry. The deceased's son-in-law, Binil Babu, told reporters that before his death, he had been appealing to the Indian embassy in Moscow for several months to release him. However, the commander said that he would be returned to India only after their 1-year contract was completed. Almost a year ago, India's Central Bureau of Investigation launched a human trafficking probe into at least 19 individuals and private companies accused of luring workers to Russia. In their complaint, investigators said the agents not only targeted job seekers but also tried to place Indian students in dubious private universities in Russia. 4 arrests were made in May on charges of fraud, human trafficking and conspiracy, but the suspects were released on bail and there have been no reports of progress in the cases since, the newspaper concluded.
NATO's highest military authority, the Military Committee, ended a 2-day meeting in Brussels on Thursday. According to Associated Press, Rob Bauer, chair of the NATO Military Committee, said the committee discussed topics including the war in Ukraine and NATO defense spending. Bauer said NATO members disclose differences to China, as it provides war material, to a great extent, to NATO countries whilst at the same time fuels a war in Europe, through its alliance with Russia. So they play a role. And we have said to China, you can't have it both ways, Bauer said. Bauer also commented on North Korea's role in the fighting in Ukraine, saying involving the most isolated country in the world was a strategic mistake. Solving the conflict in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine and Russia. It is now also about North Korea, he said.
Good evening, ladies and gents. General Cavoli and the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation Admiral Vandier. We will have opening statements and then we will gladly...
China's military-industrial base is growing and actively supporting the Russian military-industrial complex. And China is rapidly expanding its military arsenal, including nuclear, without any form of transparency. NATO has explicitly said to China, you cannot have it both ways. China cannot, on the one hand, say it wants to maintain good relations with the West and claim to uphold the UN Charter, and at the same time keep fueling the war in Europe. The increasing alignment of Russia, China, North Korea and Iran seeks to undermine the democratic norms and values we hold dear. This requires a united, strong response. And that is why we are investing more time and energy in military cooperation, interoperability and exchange of knowledge and expertise with our partners.
But also yesterday in your opening remarks. So I know that all of the...
China is basically ensuring that Russia remains in the fight with everything the Russians need to build weapons. They don't give weapons, but it's microprocessors, it is raw materials, all the things the Russians need for mass production in the defense industry come to a great extent from China. So they play a role, and we have said to China, you can't have it both ways. I mean, you can't say you want to be friends with us and trade and with the Europeans and the Americans, and at the same time fuel a war in Europe. That's not good. And the Russian-Chinese relationship is very unclear what it leads to, but the implications of that relationship in the longer term is also, of course, of great concern.
My voice is not good, guys. Okay, I'm going to give one to each of them because Leo can't get mad at me anymore.
It's a huge change that North Korea, the most isolated country in the world, now suddenly is a player. And the result of that they are in Europe fighting for the Russians, means that the Indo-Pacific is now suddenly connected to the European theater in a way that nobody thought for possible. That has huge consequences. So solving the conflict in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine and Russia. It is now also about North Korea. It is also about Iran. It's also about China. So it complicates the finding a solution, I think. It makes it more complex, at least. And secondly, I think it was a strategic mistake to have North Korea involved in this way.